So this is a talk in two parts. It's a talk about non-probabilistic ways that other national climate assessments have taken in terms of trying to represent the current modelling uncertainty in a non-probabilistic sense. And the second part is perhaps about based on work that Carol McSweeney has done in the kind of value judgments you might want to go through if you were to do this for a particular region or area. So this is going to shock some of my colleagues who've been giving seminars earlier this week. So there's no Bayesian model, there's no experimental design, there's no emulation, there's no surrogate models. But the kind of the motivation, so coming from a perspective of somebody who produces probabilistic climate change projections for the UK, so that's my background. If you weren't here yesterday, that process I think is definitely aspirational. I think it's something that we should be working towards. I think those frameworks enable us to pull together multiple strands of evidence and present that information in a consistent, coherent way where you can look at the influence of different strands of evidence. But it's hard, it's bloody hard, and very few people have managed to do that. And when you do it, you're having to make some pretty strong pragmatic choices. You have to communicate what those choices are. And so I suspect for a significant portion of the people who've come to this workshop, approaching a full probabilistic approach to climate change projection is probably not tractable this year or next year. It's something we're working towards. So I wanted to kind of motivate. I also think you have to be very brave to do that. So the kind of motivation is that there are simpler ways to kind of quantify uncertainty or to select models that kind of and present it within that quantitative sense about what part of the overall uncertainty are you exploring. And I just wanted to touch on a few of those. And there's really two parts to this talk. The first part, I'm going to give you a couple of examples from other national assessments. So the Australian and the Dutch climate projections, and talk about how they've approached uncertainty. And the second part, I want to talk through some of this idea about how you might select or reject current CMIT5 models, for example, based on both the range of responses and their performance. Okay, so so the Australian Climate Futures report and data was released earlier late last year, and there's both a data portal where you can pull down data, but there's also a lot of guidance and in terms of how they present that data to their users in Australia. So it's a there is a probabilistic element, but most of the way they presented the data was done in a very non-probabilistic sense. So to give you an example, this is a common way that they've presented data. So this is looking at projections for a region in Australia, and what they've done is they've divided for a certain point in time in a certain scenario. They've said, look, is it going to be slightly warmer, hotter, or much hotter at this location, this scenario, and this time? And is the rainfall going to have little change in the middle? Is it going to be a bit wetter, much wetter, a bit drier, or much drier? And then what they've done is they've shown the number of current climate models from the CMIT5 ensemble that sits in each of these bins. So it's very crude, but you get a sense that there are no projections which show very dry but little warming, and that the central, here for example 12 of the 39 climate models kind of fit within this space, and then you've got a smaller number, so you've got 2 of the 30 models are out in this much hotter, wetter area. And the point is you can download that data and use that to look at decisions and what that looks like for your local area. And if you're going to download 1 or 3, you can say this gives you a context for it. So is it a fairly central estimate? Is it where most of the models are? So you might want to pull one model from this area. And if you're looking at an impact where you're sensitive to hot and dry, then you might want to make sure that one of your models is from that bin. And then you can present this kind of wider context as a way of giving a context to whereabouts in that possible model space that particular projection sits. So you can kind of contrast that to the kind of full probabilistic approach, which I talked about yesterday, and that other speakers have looked at in other contexts. So this is Tuscan summer temperatures, and you got a small chance of wetter and less warm changes in the 2030s. But you've got this. There's a covariant structure in the PDF. To warmer conditions, you tend to have drier, more severe drying in the projections, and you got this kind of simpler presentation captures some of that covariance structure. So it's quite a simple idea. It's a simple way that you can present to users or people who are going to use data the kind of wider context for an individual model and where it might sit. So I've got 4 slides now. So the Australians have done a national Australian projection device called Australian Climate Futures. They've also been heavily involved in providing climate change advice for the Pacific Islands. So I'm going to show you 4 slides that Jacqueline Brown in CSIRO put together, looking at Nauru, which is this island that sits right on the equator here. And so I'm not sure if anyone's ever visited Nauru from who's been here. So Nauru is interesting. So if you look at the raw model data, there was a national assessment of the exposure to climate change, and there's a very large uncertainty which basically comes from the range of available climate models, which span a sort of no change in the future on the low end to quite large increases in rainfall at the high end. So you're pretty confident it's not going to dry, but there's a very large uncertainty. And Jacqueline's point is that we know a lot more than this uncertainty range suggests. You can do better than this. So she will argue that the first thing you have to do when you're making projections for Nauru is to decide what are the relevant climate features for that particular island. So what are the processes that affect the climate in Nauru? And then the question is, can current climate models simulate those features well over the historical period? And if they can, then perhaps you're justified in just using the direct model output for projections. However, if you're not, then you might want to think about how these features change in the future, and maybe even if there are biases in the present day, there might still be information about the change which can be conveyed to end users. So if you're confident about this, then you can interpret this, what this means for the island, and present the interpretation. And if you're not, then we're in a much more difficult position where we aren't really able to make strong projections about changes, but we can think about this in a more of a sensitivity study. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples that she put together. So the first one really is so Nauru is this happy, smiley place in the middle of the Pacific. And the point is there, and what I'm showing you is the surface temperatures. So this is the warm pool in the observations. This is a period of fairly flat, warm temperatures, and models tend to do a very poor job of capturing this in present day. So this is the range of models, and you tend to get this double ITZ. You get this this horseshoe pattern in the sea surface temperatures, which is related to so this strange flattening of the intertropical convergence zone in the south. So it's a very challenging place to make predictions because you see the island is based right on the shoulder of the monsoon system, whereas the biases you tend to get in most models tends to leave Nauru in a much drier state. So there's a strong bias in the rainfall in present-day simulations because most models will get the monsoon system too flat and too far west. But you can say something robust about how the warm pool, and hence you would expect this monsoon system to change in the future. And so you can't really use the raw model output, but you do have some intuition about what the models are saying about the future change. So that's quite positive. This is another example, which is also incredibly relevant if you live on the island. So it's very, the rainfall is very sensitive to the ENSO state. So when you have strong La Nina conditions, so the island is basically in drought. It's very dry. It doesn't rain. When you have strong El Nino conditions, when you have an El Nino in the Pacific, so it's right in the middle of this monsoon system, and that's when it's wet and very wet. However, when you get to extreme El Ninos, you get this flattening of the monsoon system, and you might actually get not so wet. So there's a very complex relationship between ENSO and climate change. So between ENSO and rainfall that drives most of the rainfall changes in present day in Nauru. And the point is that we don't have a clear idea about how ENSO may change or may not change in the future. And so Jacqueline would argue that you really need to look at this as more as a case study. So what does the change in the you can look at changes and your physical insight from these kind of simulations, but when you come to ENSO, you need to present this information as more of a case study. So what happens if you had a very strong El Nino in a future climate? What happens if you had a weaker El Nino or a stronger El Nino? And so there are other ways to present that data that decision makers can look at in that context, that we really don't know how this process will change. So that's kind of the summary slide. So I'm going to go on to my third national assessment example, which is the Dutch one. So the Dutch have had two national climate assessments. So one in 2007, and one and they updated in 2014. And they've taken a simpler approach. So they're not presenting PDFs or histograms or even the wider context you see in the Australian. They said, look, we want to look at what is a central estimate of climate change in the future for a particular scenario. So this is this column here, and what does that look like? So they've looked at what are the plausible models in the CMIP5 archive, or the CMIP3 archive as they did this initially, and what does a central estimate from that distribution that they deem plausible in terms of the climate change. And then they said, look, this is a projection. That's the central projection we're going to put out. But they're going to consider three other cases, which are these other colours: the yellow, the pink, and the blue. So the first one they said is, what is a high-end change? So if you look at what they deem as plausible simulations of the Northern European climate, what's a high-end change look like? And that's going to be a second strand. So that there's going to be two models. You can look at a central estimate and a high-end estimate. And then they said, look, actually we're very, very prone, particularly in things like storm surges and wind changes, to changes in circulation. And we're less sure about how that's going to change. We don't want to make a probabilistic statement. So what happens if we had a very strong change to westerly flow in the future? So we're going to do a central estimate with a strong westerly flow, and a high-end estimate with a increase in the westerly flow. And so that gives you a four case matrix to start to think about central estimates of change and how it might change in another two dimensions. And they did this for CMIP3, and as we know, CMIP5 didn't actually change the kind of underlying messages we get from the models. And so when they updated these projections, they didn't actually change these underlying data. They felt that was robust to the current uncertainties in the climate modelling. So if you can come up with strategies which you can feel are robust. I'm just going to give a very quick context to that. So they actually applied the same approach to the UK, where we have the UK probabilistic projections, which I showed yesterday. So they looked at this in East Anglia, which is the orange region. And this is a comparison of the PDF approach, which I discussed yesterday, and these four cases. And my first take on this is this looks terrible. You've got a tiny sample through the underlying uncertainty. But I think it's understandable in a sense, because in the PDF we're taking into account many other forms of uncertainty you can't do in the simpler case. So you've got carbon cycle uncertainties that none of the CMIP5 models can capture. You've got discrepancy, you've got modelling uncertainty. So if you're looking at CMIP5 models and sampling them, I would argue that the Dutch approach is actually quite a useful first approach to modelling uncertainty. It gives users an accessible way to start thinking about how climate can change, which is this, and perhaps some of the uncertainties in that climate change by looking at the other cases. Okay, so that's the end of my first part of my talk. I'm doing very well, actually. I want to spend the second half talking a bit about some work that Carol McSweeney has led, thinking about how to use select multimodal simulations from multimodal archives to explore the range of possible changes in a particular area. Area. Okay, so this is kind of framing the problem. So this is some work we did in our 2012 paper. So looking at the changes in this case in June, July, August, September, temperature in this axis, and rainfall over Vietnam at the end of the century. So these are a range of models that explore some of the underlying modelling uncertainty. And so perhaps the most important thing, so the first step that Carol is arguing here is that you want to kind of select models which span, in some sense, this underlying modelling uncertainty. So you might take a central estimate in the middle, but you want to kind of get an idea of what is the high end or the low end in both dimensions. So if your decisions are sensitive to both the rainfall change and the temperature change, then in some sense, can you select models from the available models which span that range of possible outcomes? So that's the motivation. But then you have this question about how realistic are those models? Are they all equally likely? Are there some aspects of these models which means you might not want to consider them? Okay, so this is a bit of a can of worms, and we don't tend to, when we think about global climate models in a global sense, in IPCC reports, we don't tend to say one model was better than the other. So Ritu argued that in the previous IPCC assessment, AR5, it would be the end of multimodal democracy. We're going to start saying which ones are better, and we didn't. But maybe on a regional scale, we need to do this, and I'll show you some examples about why that's the case. So I'm not sure this metaphor works. In the UK, if you talk about opening a can of worms, you're opening up questions which have more problems than answers. But so there's a question about whether and how you do this, and I guess so. The key really is can you link aspects of poor present-day performance directly to the model's ability to simulate future plausible climate changes? So that's the kind of key principle I think you need to think about if you were to consider doing this. Okay, so some examples. So basically, this is the framework that that we're arguing you should think about when you do this process. So in some cases, you'll find significant errors in simulation in present day. I'll give you some examples in a tick that are linked to your confidence in projections. And where that happens, in all cases, we would argue just reject those models. They're not worth looking at. At the other end of the spectrum, you might be comfortable in the climate model's performance in your particular area. It gets the processes right for present day, and you might have confidence in the processes that's relating to, in which case you can consider those. And then there's this intermediate step where there might be significant shortcomings in present day. There might be errors in those models in present day, like in Niru for the monsoon system, but they might not be obviously linked to the processes.
What do you mean by not clearly linked?
I will show you. I'll come on to this. So I'm going to give you examples. So she argues that whether there are other climate models, so where you have a model which has an error that's not linked to the projections, but there are other models that also have that future response that don't have errors, then you should still exclude that, just reject it. But if this is part of the possible future response space, it's an outlier and it tells you something about an end of what might be plausible future changes, then it might be worth considering that still. And I'll give you some examples in a couple of different contexts. So, so this is an example of implausible. So in this case, we were looking at monsoon changes in the future in Southeast Asia, particularly Vietnam, down here. So this is our 2012 paper. And this is the pictures from the monsoon system from 9 different GCMs. And you can see that they share many features. They get this circulation pattern which draws moist air up over India. But these two in particular don't extend that monsoon system flow over Southeast Asia. It does not exist in present day. So if we would argue that if you don't have a monsoon system over Vietnam in present day, it's very hard to use those models in an informative way to tell you about how the monsoon system can change in the future. So this is a really nice case where you would just, for this context in this region, you might reject those before you sample your spread. So this is an example where it's less obvious. So I'm looking at here biases, even significant biases in the Sahel. So this is the West Sahel region on the left, and the East Sahel region on the right. And the observations are in this solid black line in each case, and I'm showing you temperature and rainfall. And what you have is you have a range. For example, in the Sahel region, as you go from January through to December, you get this seasonal peak in the Sahel rainfall as the ICTP moves north and then goes south. And the models tend to capture that peak and decline, but there's a huge difference in the magnitude. So a couple overestimate up here. Most lots underestimate that seasonality of the monsoon rain. But the question is that error related to the future change? And so, for example, in the West Sahel case, some of those models just have the ITZ too far south. They catch the process, which is the seasonal northward and southward shift. So they have the sensitivity to the north-south change in temperature. But because there's a mean bias in the location, it's not getting the magnitude right. So it's an example of an error where you can still make some inference perhaps about the future change, because the bias isn't necessarily telling you something about the process, only about the magnitude. So that's the example of that second case. So just to kind of go back to implausible, what's implausible? So this is some work that we did, so that Eleanor Martin led, looking at particularly this West Sahel rainfall. And what we did is looked at, so there's a big literature looking at observations that links the seasonal and interannual decadal variability in this rainfall to the temperature contrast in the North Atlantic to the South Atlantic, to the temperatures over the Guinea coast, to the temperatures in the Indian Ocean. And what this very complicated colourful plot does up here on the top left is it shows you the correlations from different models in the CMIT5 archive that they have in reproducing the observed correlation between those different ocean basins and the rainfall change. So I'm just going to go out to the camera. So this is the Indian Ocean up here. This is the North Atlantic, this is the Mediterranean, and this is the tropical North Atlantic contrast. And you can see that models tend to do much better at these three, and all models are terrible at the Indian Ocean correlation with rainfall. So that's an interesting question, but let's put that aside and just look at the Atlantic connections and the Mediterranean. What we did here is we chose models which were either good, we classed as good, in that they got the correlations between rainfall and temperature changes in green. So there's one here, one here, one here. So we selected models which were good, and we also selected models which were poor, which were either reds, lots of reds, or lots of yellows. And then we compared how the decadal changes in rainfall from the good models here and the poor models here compared to observations. And what you can see is the good models are able to capture this interdecadal shift in rainfall that you see in the observations, particularly for the West Sahel, if not the eastern part of Africa. But the poor models really we're unable to capture that interdecadal changes. So this could be another example of a way you might want to reject models as being implausible. Okay, so I've got a few more slides. So in Carol's 2014 paper, she considered 3 regions, so Europe, Africa, and Southeast Asia, and she selected different metrics or criteria that you might want to look at in those different regions depending on the meteorology. So in Europe, she looked at lower tropospheric wind fields, she looked at the storm tracks, and she looked at the annual cycle of temperature and rainfall. Over Africa, she looked at the lower tropospheric winds, the relationship with SSTs, and the annual cycle of temperature and rainfall. Southeast Asia, again, the low tropospheric winds and the monsoon flow, the annual cycles of temperature and rainfall, and other aspects of the monsoon. And what she's doing here, this is a very complicated slide, but this is the payload slide, if you like. This is the one where she's discussing this. So so what she did is she first ruled out all those models which are implausible. They are not informative about the processes you're interested in those regions. So anything in purple, you can exclude. The grey models were models where there was no boundary conditions to drive regional models, and she was interested in the regional modelling, so she couldn't consider those, so she just ignored the grey. The orange and the yellow models had some significant biases, but they weren't fatal in that sense. So they were that middle category. And here she said, look, we're going to keep these orange models because they explore parts of possible future changes. So Europe over December, January, February, they're showing future possible changes. This is suddenly stopped working. Where there are very low rainfall changes. So if you wanted to select models that span the range of future changes, you might want to still consider these, even though there are some significant biases, because those biases weren't obviously linked to the changes in the future. And where there were the yellow ones where there were significant biases, but because they're right in the middle of the pack, and there are other models that can span that space, you set them aside. So that's the kind of decision framework that she's putting forward. And when you do that, so what she's shown here is selecting 8 models from the range of models for these 3 different regions for both rainfall and temperature, and then she's plotting at the bottom here what are the range of the total intermodal spread that you can explain by those sub-selected models which you somehow class as not implausible. And you can see over West Africa that you're exploring pretty much 90% of the model range, whereas over parts of Central Europe, excluding those models, you explore a smaller part of the possible range, but still an appreciable part of the range. So this is a way of kind of giving yourself a context of, if you were to take this approach, how effective are you at spanning the range, or how much does ruling out really, really bad models actually reduce the spread of futures. So I think I want to summarize Carol's method, and then I've got one more slide after this. So what we're arguing here is that you can take, that there are simple approaches, non-probabilistic approaches to sampling modelling uncertainty that in a meaningful way that enable you to kind of sample that wider underlying uncertainty you get across the whole ensemble. The key stages is to look at whether your models are implausible. Are there grounds you can just rule them out because they don't represent the key processes you need to represent the processes in your region? But the other step is where the realism is poor, but maybe not obviously linked to the process of change in the future. Whether you include them or exclude them perhaps depends on whether they themselves are a unique outlier or not. So that's kind of the summary. And I think this is useful. I hope this is useful for those people who are thinking about sort of cortex downscaling or just a cautionary note, if you like. So this is a figure from the Australian Climate Futures that came out last year. This is from their Chapter 6, which is Climate Change of Australia. And what they've shown here, I'm going to go off camera, is the full range of all CMIP5 model responses for changes in rainfall at a particular point in the future. So there's a small chance of a moistening. The central estimate is about a 10% decrease in rainfall, but it could go all the way down to about 27% decrease. There's a broad range of projected changes in rainfall in this region in Australia. So there are two studies here. So I want you to pay attention to where are they? To these two. So this one here is based on the Ian Watterson study, and what Ian Watterson's done is he's looked at drying in Australia and classified the 10 best models in CMIP5 at their ability to simulate circulation. So the 10 best models in their ability to get surface temperature, rainfall, and mean sea level pressure over Australia. So the 10 best are down here, and the 10 worst are up here. And what that says is that those observations suggest that you have stronger drying in that region in Australia. However, Granger et al. In 2013, in the same year, looked at circulation variability and its links to ENSO, and they found that their 10 best models were up here, and their 10 worst models were down here, there on that metric. And so they would argue that more modest reductions in rainfall. So you've got, this is just a cautionary note, you can have, from this kind of analysis, very conflicting bits of information that comes through. So I'm going to summarize, and maybe I can have 5 minutes questions before I hand over the podium. So the summary is, I'll leave this up actually. So are there any questions? Here's some. Thank you.
I would almost speculate that this last example that you show, that two researchers come up with different matrices that show completely opposite results, can be done for almost every region, actually. This is my speculation, okay? You tell me something for South Asia, I provide you a different set of parameters that show that other models are better. So my speculation, okay?
Okay. I think I'm going to leave that comment to stand. I would hope that's not the case, but it's worth thinking about in this context.
Yes, I did. Oh, okay. So do I still have to do this? Yes. Okay. This is weird, but I didn't attend the discussions, but have you guys discussed the issue of bias correction? And if yes or if not, what is your opinion about using bias correction techniques to, you know, or bias whatever techniques, I don't know, people call it in different ways, to actually offset some of the problems you talked about?
So there has been some discussion earlier this week about bias correction, not in passing, it's not very focused. And I think there are pros and cons, as I'm sure you're more aware than most of us. I think understanding the process is really important. So if you go back to this, if you go back to this bias in the West African monsoon system, so there's clearly a big range of monsoon rainfalls across the models, but I think we understand that if you understand why there's a range of changes, and that the ITZ in many cases is located too far south, but the actual mechanism change in the models may be correct, then you're in a better position to consider bias correction. In that case, if you scaled up the rainfall change to something closer to the observations, you're correcting the mean bias in the location of the event, because you have confidence the models can capture the north and south transition. So if you have confidence they can capture the north to south transition, then maybe you can justify doing that in that case. But this is kind of outside my field, and I don't think I want to make any stronger statement, but perhaps you have more of an informed comment.
Long discussion, just wondering whether it was with your
Okay.